In the mid-1960s, Bob Dylan was a musical and cultural phenomenon. A revolutionary folk singer, constantly provoking the status quo, he produced an immense body of work in a very brief career. With 1965's Bringing It All Back Home, he left the folk world behind him to explore uncharted territory. Dylan epitomised the growing counterculture, baiting the press and the establishment whilst creating some of the most definitive music of the period.
Do you think of yourself primarily as a singer or as a poet?
Well, I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
Revered by fellow musicians for his bravery and insight, by 1966 he had secured his position as the world's most important singer-songwriter. Yet weeks before the release of his seminal album Blonde on Blonde, a motorcycle accident pulled him from the public eye.
It became one of those totems of the whole kind of counterculture that happened because of Dylan. But the guy who created the environment for that to happen had vanished. He'd gone, they didn't know where, and it all went quiet.
This is the story of the years following that disappearance. Dylan struggled to maintain the impetus created by his mid-60s work and his triumphant return to the world stage in the 1970s.
While a lot of people still saw him as a 60s figurehead, it seemed as though halfway through the 70s he was still able to command attention and demand a powerful audience.
While many of his contemporaries failed to accustom themselves to a new decade and an ever-changing musical climate, Dylan emerged victorious. This is the story of that victory, the story of an ever-changing icon. In July 1966, on this road in Woodstock, New York, Bob Dylan fell from a motorcycle and subsequently from the public eye. After heavy touring with the band, being followed by D.A. Pennebaker for a further documentary, and releasing Blonde on Blonde to unanimous praise, the singer literally disappeared from the media arena, retreating to the Woodstock area of New York amid heavy speculation over the extent of his injuries and the seriousness of his condition. Aronowitz, a prominent New York post-rock journalist, was the first to interview him about the crash.
Well, he made it sound very dramatic. And now that I look back, I guess he was putting me on. He said, my whole life passed in front of me.
Whatever the reason behind Dylan's retreat to Woodstock, it gave him a significant opportunity to slow down and reassess his life. Re-editing Pennebaker's rushes of the '66 tour, Eat the Document, and spending time with his wife and family, Dylan made no attempts during the close of the year to re-enter the public arena.
The retreat in Woodstock was absolutely vital. If he hadn't got off the roller coaster at that point, I mean, he himself has subsequently said he doesn't think he would have lived. I mean, he was going so fast that it was absolutely unsustainable, and he just had to stop. And the motorcycle accident, whatever the circumstances of it, how serious or not it was, served a very, very important process, really, for him.
He couldn't have carried on like that. There's absolutely no way he could have carried on. And after the motorcycle accident, Dylan spent a long period of time, something like 6 months, sitting and watching the footage of the film that Pennebaker had shot on the '66 tour. And I suspect that Dylan, who was obviously straightening out, probably detoxing at that point, was looking at this footage going, who is this goddamn maniac?
Over the following 2 years, Dylan concentrated much of his time on his wife Sarah and their children. Woodstock represented an idyll in which he could become a very private family man.
I believe that the happiest time in a man's life is when he's raising a family. And I think that a guy like Bob, no matter how miserable he might be, has to look back at that time when he was raising a family as the happiest time in his life. Because his marriage with Sarah, I mean, you know, she was such a calming influence on him. And she never lost her equanimity. She was very queenly.
In the early months of 1967, the band began to jam with Dylan at his Woodstock home. The routine later continued at Big Pink, a nearby house the group rented. At 1 o'clock every afternoon, the musicians would gather in the basement to play and record dozens of random tracks in the most relaxed and congenial atmosphere. Aronowitz was a regular visitor.
They were just having fun. They were just getting together and having fun, doing all kinds of crazy things that they want to do to have fun. I mean, they would get together and there would be like comedians would get together and one comedian tells a joke and the next comedian says, the punchline reminds me of another joke, and the next comedian says, that punchline reminds me of another joke. And that's, you know, they would make him go around and singing a song. That song reminds me of this song reminds. And I was mostly entertained by Levon, who sang with the mandolin, who was a great, I love Levon.
The resultant recordings, known as the basement tapes, were not officially released until 1975, but circulated for years as bootlegs. A mixture of originals and folk and country traditionals, the songs were far warmer and more laid back than those of Dylan's defining mid-60s albums.
He probably had gone as far as he could with that thin mercury sound, as he called it, that reached its epitome on Blonde on Blonde. It was very hard to see how he could top that. So a change of direction was required. And to delve back into the deep into the roots of American folklore, what Grail Marcus called the old, weird, mythic America, was a perfectly logical thing for him to do.
He resented that media speculation and that intensity of fan interest. And the basement tapes are great because it is just Dylan letting his hair down, and he's just having fun. And really, up until then, they were quite saying, "You mustn't have fun. You're Bob Dylan. You know, you're very serious. You know, we want Desolation Row and Masters of War. We don't. You know, you mustn't have fun." So there was that sort of expectation that every Dylan album was a statement. And listening to basement tapes now, you can hear them just, you know, they're just having fun. They're larking around. You know, the bands, you know, going from drums to saxophone, and you know, and yet out of it all, these, you know, there are some incredible performances.
Despite being hidden from his audience and from the relentless gaze of the media, Dylan's year in the wilderness was proving productive, and he began to work on material for a follow-up to Blonde on Blonde.
1967 is the great lost year of Dylan's career. It's also unquestionably the most creative year of his career. So it's this total loss in the sense nobody knows what he was up to, and yet he created more great material in 1967 than any other year in his life. It was an extraordinary creative outburst that produced the basement tapes and John Wesley Harding in a 6-month period, which is an unbelievable achievement. And yet Dylan had shut down. I mean, he'd removed himself from the vortex. What you end up with is that Dylan and, if you like, the counterculture go their separate ways. And again, that was clearly a very self-conscious thing on Dylan's part. I mean, if you read the sleeve notes to John Wesley Harding, where he actually says, "How far do you want to go in?" And the guy says, Frank says,